thank you. And after that introduction, we should proceed to the closing questions. It's nice to be introduced as a windbag for about 30 minutes. But anyway, but thank you for inviting me to come here. This is not something that I expected to be asked to do, but I welcome it. I rejoice in discussing this subject. It's a very important subject. It's very interesting and it's very controversial, not just in the Bahá'í community, but in the world at large. And we know this. Right now it's part of human rights, it's part of an issue of prejudice, it's part of an issue of science, it's part of an issue of medicine, politics, the definition of marriage, military service, inheritance law, legal jurisprudence, you name it. Almost every aspect of modern society is affected by various issues related to homosexuality. We see some people in the world that seem to be rather obsessed with it. Some people who seem to be more concerned with the sins of other people than their own sins and have made it their goal in life to try and eradicate it from other people. Sometimes in the name of religion, even though all religion teaches to not be concerned. We see other people who, for various reasons, champion the rights of homosexuals, gays, lesbians, transgender, bisexuals, all the different terms that we use. We see people fighting on all sorts of political fronts, all sorts of social fronts, trying to work towards this. We see scientists and doctors and psychologists and researchers madly getting grants all over the world now to study it in various forms. We see that they use different terminology in their studies. Some call it homosexuality, some call it same-sex attraction, some call it gay, lesbian, and so on. And quite often you can tell their bias just by the terminology they use, because each of the different camps use different terminology. Sometimes we read of teenagers who are brutally beaten up in school, or they're bullied. Sometimes we find that they're even killed because of this issue. And we read of all these tragic stories. People committing suicide because society has made them feel so unworthy that they would prefer to not go on living. These are all things that are in the vortex of this issue. And within this context, we're told that the manifestation of God comes in each age and addresses the needs of mankind. He has his finger on the pulse of humanity. He diagnoses a disease and prescribes the remedy. This is what we're told. And Baha'u'llah says that every age has its own needs, and be anxiously concerned with the needs of your age. So surely if a messenger of God has come in this age, he must have the solution, the answers to any person who's perplexed by this issue on whatever side. There must be something in the Baha'i writings. Why did Baha'u'llah come if he could not address the needs of society? So that's really what I want to do today. A lot of times Baha'is will have deepenings on this subject. Even the word deepening, it seems to imply that we're going to get together and read Baha'i quotations. And we're just going to read them, and then we're going to maybe have a little bit of discussion. And I'm sure all of you have done that on this subject before. And if not, you're perfectly able to do so. There's plenty of compilations that are published. So rather than do that tonight, I prefer to just discuss some of my own ideas in relation to some kind of framework. We need some kind of framework to look at these things. If we don't have that, we're not really going to understand it. So this may not be the same kind of talk that you've heard on this subject before, and that's fine. There's plenty of ways to look at this subject. So I want to do that, but before I do, I want to mention there's two things I'm not going to do tonight. You know what I'm going to do now, but there's two things I'm not going to do. One, I'm not going to engage in any form of political arguments or discussions. And two, I'm not going to engage in any arguments. I'm not going to argue with anybody. That's okay. And it's not because I don't enjoy a good political discussion or a good argument. No, in fact, I do. It's that we are prohibited as Baha'is to engage in these two things. We are prohibited to engage in politics because it's divisive and it doesn't lead to anything, and we're also prohibited to engage in argument. When it comes to argument, I just want to read you this statement. Abdu'l-Baha said, and this is from the Tablets of Divine Plan, if two souls quarrel and contend about a question of the divine questions, differing and disputing, both are wrong. The wisdom of this incontrovertible law of God is this, that between two souls from amongst the believers of God, no contention and dispute might arise, that they may speak with each other with infinite amity and love. Should there appear the least trace of controversy, they must remain silent, and both parties must continue their discussion no longer. So, after reading this statement from Bahá'í, I prepared 2 talks. I actually, wrote out the notes to 2 talks. And I can give one or the other depending on whether we get into any kind of argument. The first talk I prepared is a complete, full and frank discussion on the issues of homosexuality, with no holds barred, getting into the real nitty-gritty of every aspect of homosexuality. That's the first talk I prepared. The second talk I prepared is on the general principles of organic vegetable gardening. Okay. And I have this, which is also a subject very interesting to me. It's something that I like very much, and it's fascinating, and we can all get a lot out of it. And I'll try with the first talk, but if it goes a certain way, I'm just going to say, well, how about those potatoes? And move on to that. And then we can all learn how to grow our potatoes without, pesticides and insecticides, and we'll gain something out of that too. But this is only an instruction to Bahá'í, which he says that if arguments arise and there's not love and amity, cease the conversation. He didn't say talk about vegetable gardening, but that's what I'm going to do. So I want to begin, because I want to think in terms of an overall framework. I want to talk about the forest for a moment before we look at the trees. And I want to talk about the concept of spiritual law. Spiritual law is a very interesting concept, and you find it embedded in a lot of passages from Baha'u'llah, Bahá'í defending the House of Justice. And I'm particularly interested, I've been rereading, after talking to Rain a couple weeks ago, the book Phenomenon of Man by Teilhard de Chardin. Does everyone know the French philosopher, 20th century? He died in about 55, I think he lived from 1880 to 1955. Very famous philosopher, probably considered the most respected religious, spiritual philosopher of the 20th century. And he wrote a book published upon his death in 1959 called The Phenomenon of Man. It's one of those books that everybody has on their shelf and nobody's read. It's one of those kind of books if you had them. But I like to dig into it. And I found 2 quotes in it that really summarize his philosophy, which relates to spiritual law. The first quote I want to read to you comes from this book. He says, "Someday, after mastering the winds, the waves, the tides and gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love. And then for a second time in the history of the world, man will have discovered fire." And this is one of his main themes. He believes that we are at a spiritual evolutionary point in human history. As significant and as much a turning point as the discovery was fire was. And one of his other main themes is that the physical world is a lower representation of the spiritual world. And just as there is physical development in the discovery of winds and power and energy and fire, so also is there spiritual development. And he believes that we are actually in a period of time in which there is spiritual maturity going on in the world, that something great is happening. So much so that the Universal House of Justice, when they wrote the peace message in 1986, they quoted Teilhard de Chardin. They said, "In the words of one great thinker, the planetization of mankind." In a message to the peoples of the world, rather than quoting Baha'u'llah, they quoted de Chardin because they realized how respected he is, and this is one of his concepts. The other statement I want to read to you is one which has been widely quoted for many years, and I'm going to read it. It comes from the same book. He says, "You are not a human being in search of a spiritual experience. You are a spiritual immersed in a human experience." Now, many people have quoted this, and I have seen on the internet a lot of people attribute this quotation to Stephen Covey because it's in his book, The 7 Habits of
highly
whatever people. Okay, and it's also often quoted by Wayne Dyer, because Wayne Dyer says it every time. But both of these people wrote 20 or 30 years after it. It's in Teilhard de Chardin's book, but it's a very interesting concept, and people quote it a lot. We are not a physical being having a spiritual experience. We are a spiritual being having a physical experience. And this is very much in line with the Bahá'í concept. The Bahá'í concept says that you are a spiritual being. You, your reality, the true nature of you and you and you and you, everyone is a soul, a spirit. It's more accurate not to say your true nature is a soul and a spirit, as it is to say you have a dual element to you. You are a spirit dwelling for a short time in a physical body. This is what we call the dual nature of man. But of the dual nature, the one that's dwelling in the other is the true nature. So when I talk about the true you, I am not talking about your body. I'm not talking about your physical nature, your physical inclinations, your physical desires. Your true reality, your true self is your soul. I'm going to read you a quotation. This is from the Universal House of Justice. It says, Baha'u'llah attests that through the teachings of the manifestation of God, every man will advance and develop until he attaineth the station at which he can manifest all the potential forces which his inmost true self hath been endowed. So what they're saying here is that you have in your inmost true self, your soul, your spirit, you have certain potential forces. And through the manifestation of God, those forces will be released. That's what they're saying. And he goes on to say, Abdu'l-Baha observes that should man's natural qualities be used and displayed in an unlawful way, they become blameworthy. Shoghi Effendi, in a letter dated May 25, 1936, written on his behalf, identifies man's true self with his soul. In describing the nature of man's inner spiritual self or reality, he notes that, quote, two tendencies, for good or evil, are but manifestations of a single reality of self, and that the self is capable of development in either way. Underlining the importance of education and the actualization of man's potential, the Guardian concludes, all depends fundamentally on the training or education which man receives. Human nature is made up of possibilities, both for good and evil. True religion can enable it to soar in the highest realm of the spirit, while its absence can, as we have already witnessed around us, cause it to fall to the lowest depths of degradation and misery. Now, in thinking about spiritual law, I want to mention an article which I read a couple of days ago, which fascinated me. It made me laugh in a way because it called to mind a lot of research that's going on. And it was on one of these websites, and the title of the article was 5 Things That Will Be Cured in Your Lifetime. That's what was the title of the article. And I notice now everything is now 7 things or 8 things or 12 things. Have you noticed that? Everything is, they like to list how many things. So I just clicked it on 5 things. And it was quite a scientific article. It was written from a scientific perspective. And it listed the 5 things that it said will be solved or cured in our lifetime because science has found that all of these things have a physical component. And they've had a physical component. And I want to mention what these are, and I'm not going to go into the research, but we can look at it if you want. They said the first thing that will be cured, they said, is gambling. They said gambling will be cured in our lifetime because science has found that gambling has certain physical components in the brain, and that some people have it and some people don't, and they've been able to identify the location in the brain, and that gambling will be cured in our lifetime, they say. And it's very interesting. You can read it, and you can see the various receptors and where the... So they're talking about that. And so you think, okay, this is interesting. Then they say the second thing that is going to be cured in our lifetime is procrastination. Okay, because they said that there is research that it shows that procrastination has a certain physical component. Okay, and I have been aware of, over the last 4 or 5 years, I have seen documentation on this, but I've never gotten around to reading it, unfortunately. But I was vaguely aware that that was the case. The third thing they said that will be solved in our lifetime is infidelity. Because as you know, the last 2 or 3 years, there's been research that they've found a particular, what they call the party gene, or the gene that makes certain people want to have sex with a lot of people. Heterosexuals, they just want to party on, and other people don't, and they've actually found locations in the brain, certain receptors, has been pointed out. The next thing they said that will be solved is anger. Okay, and that made me really mad when I realized that one could be resolved.
Our roads would be safe.
And that's what they said. They said anger. And the last one they said, or first, I guess, because it's like a countdown, they said is alcoholism. And the reason they said this is that there's been more research on the physical nature of alcoholism than anything else, because a lot of money has gone into it, because so many people suffer from it and so many people die from it, and it's such an important issue in government, so there's a lot of government research into it. And when I read this, I kind of laughed, because this is something we've all pretty much known since May of 1973. Now, what happened in May of 1973? Everybody should know this, because in May of 1973, a major turning point in the history of science, and particularly neuroscience or molecular biology, occurred with the work of Solomon Snyder and Candace Pert. How many are familiar with the Candace Pert research in 1973? We should all read this, because basically what happened is that they found in 1973 at Johns Hopkins University, they identified the very first receptor, as you were pointing out, and it so happened it was the opiate receptor, a receptor that causes pleasure in the mind, that it was the opiate receptor, the same receptor that's triggered by opium, but also naturally triggered, we found out later on. This went on to become noted as, quote, the most cited scientific paper in all of modern biology, the Snyder-Pert, and you can go and look it up. Got the Pulitzer Prize. Of course, Snyder went on to get a whole department at Johns Hopkins, and then he founded a company. He was an instant millionaire, just the day he founded the company, because of the discovery that certain things that we formerly thought were psychological, or we formerly thought were choice, or we formerly thought were a matter of personality, things that we formerly thought were choice or personality or psychological, were found to have a physical component. And in the research since that time, and particularly in all the late 1970s and early 1980s, we found that things like gambling, alcoholism, all kinds of addictive personalities also had a physical component. And basically they found that your brain cells, you have a lot of brain cells, they're 60% fat. 60% of your brain cells fat. I know some people that are 60% fat too, but your brain cell is like that. And sitting on the top, they say, just like a little lily pad on the fat, is there that thing called the receptor. And then there are transmitters, and they transmit the things. And this is how emotions are passed on. This is how feelings are passed on. This is how joy is passed on. It was first reported in a big way in a book called Molecules of the Mind, which I believe is in the early 1980s, which won the Pulitzer Prize. Go and read that book if you're interested. Because one of the things they found that had a physical component, which was formerly considered psychological, was homosexuality. They found various physical components in the brain, certain locations in the brain that were different amongst those that were lesbians or gays or transgenders, bisexuals. They were different to those that were heterosexual. That there was a physical component to homosexuality, just as there is a physical component to gambling and anger and procrastination and all kinds of other things. Now, this is fascinating. It's interesting in relation to religion, because many of the things they found that had a physical component, many of the things they found were prohibited by various religions. Gambling is prohibited, alcoholism is prohibited, homosexuality and other forms of sexual behavior, they're prohibited, and yet they found that man inherited, or at least developed very early, physical predilections towards these various things. Now, the word predilection became very important in the 1970s and 80s. That, or predilection, I guess is the way to pronounce it. Because they said that if you have these physical things in your brain, or in your body, or perhaps in your genes, they said if you have these things, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to be a gambler, it doesn't guarantee you're going to be an alcoholic or gay, but it gives you a predilection. Predilection means you're predisposed towards it, you favor it. And they found that you would have this. Now, I want to read a quotation, this once again from the Universal House of Justice. They say, "The material world in relation to the spiritual world is a world of imperfections." This is a very important thing to remember. The material world in relation to the spiritual world is the world of imperfections. So when we think about the spiritual and physical duality, we have to remember that one is a world of imperfections. And they go on to say, "It is full of dangers and difficulties, which have been generally aggravated by man's neglect and misuse of his responsibilities. Human society itself, which exists in the material world, is in a disastrous disarray. Our appetites and inclinations are strongly influenced by the condition of our physical makeup, and our bodies are in various degrees of health, depending on factors such as heredity, environment, nourishment, and our own treatment of them. Genetic variations occur." I want to make this clear. This is the House of Justice. They say genetic variations occur. People are not all the same. "Producing conditions which can create problems for the individual. Some conditions are emotional or psychological in nature, producing such imbalances as quickness to anger, recklessness, timorousness, and so forth. Others involve purely physical characteristics." Let's get this clear. The House of Justice is saying some are psychological, but others involve purely physical characteristics, resulting not only in unusual capacities, but also in handicaps or diseases of various kinds. So now I'm thinking, okay, well, what kind of a God is it that creates a dual nature of man, and then creates this physical body, and then gives the physical body imperfections? Why does he do that? And then he gives different people different imperfections. It's a question that's in my mind as I read this, and we'll see if we can answer that. But they continue on. They say, "Whether deficiencies are inborn or acquired, our purpose in life is to overcome them, and to train ourselves in accordance with the pattern that is revealed to us in the divine teachings." And this is fascinating, because they're saying that it does not matter whether the deficiencies are inborn or acquired. That's not really an issue as to whether or not you should try to overcome. Whether they're inborn or whether they're acquired, one must try to overcome them. So basically, we come to this conclusion that people are tested. And they're tested by their physical nature. The soul that's having a human experience for 70 years, part of that human experience is to have to deal with imperfections, and we're tested. But science has found that we are all tested in some way, but we're not all tested in the same way. It's a very important principle. We're all tested in some way, but we're not all tested in the same way. And this is a very humbling thing, because we all need to understand that spiritual law says we have to overcome our test. We must overcome our test. Nobody is free of tests. Nobody is free of imperfections. Although I may have a different imperfection than you, and you may have a different one than me, but our goal in life is to overcome them. And the reason we've been given these physical experience is to release the true nature of our higher self. This is the path whereby our higher self will be released. And the House of Justice has said that this desire to regulate and control the physical imperfections is part of spiritual law. It's not part of physical law. It's spiritual law. The concept of spiritual law is very, very important. I'll read you one statement. The House of Justice says, "Just as there are laws governing our physical lives, requiring that we must supply our bodies with certain food, maintain them within a certain range of temperatures, and so forth, if we wish to avoid physical disabilities, so also there are laws governing our spiritual lives. These laws are revealed to mankind in each age by the manifestation of God, and obedience to them is of vital importance if each human being and mankind in general is to develop properly and harmoniously." So they're saying there are spiritual laws. Now, with physical laws, we're generally grateful if somebody tells us a physical law, and we thank them. So if you didn't know the law of gravity, and you walk near a cliff and someone said, "Don't step over that cliff," and then they see somebody else step over and fall, they'd thank you. Thank you very much for letting me know of that physical law. But if you tell somebody a spiritual law, they don't thank you so much. In fact, they say, get out of my face, or shut up, or who are you to talk about it, and so on. We have a different attitude. The reason is that we do not have a perspective on whether or not the spiritual law is valuable or not. The law of gravity we very quickly learn. There's a very short window of time between when we're told the physical law to when we realize it's true. But the window of time of a spiritual law can be 60 or 70 years. However, we have to assume that if there is a God, and if he reveals himself through his manifestations, that perhaps he can see things and know things that we can't know. So I like to think of it like this. Have any of you ever had to back a truck out of a driveway? Maybe you don't have a rear view mirror, and what you do is somebody stands in a different spot back there, and they say, okay, back here, a little to the left, a little to the right, stop, and so on. They do that because that's the only way you can get out. Because from where you sit, from your vantage point, you cannot see what to do. And you trust that that person is in a different location, and from their frame of reference, they're in a better position to guide you. We have to think of the manifestation of God like this. As we are backing out our spiritual truck from the driveway of life, we have to imagine that the manifestation of God is in a different location, and he's able to guide us. What does it say in the tablet of Ahmad? It says, the nightingale of paradise singeth from where? He's singing on the twigs of the tree of eternity. That's some serious twigs. Yes, he's on the serious twigs of a serious tree in a different location. He's calling us to from there with his little wings, the nightingale, saying, over here, over there, no, stop there, and so on, because he has a perspective that we don't have. That is the fundamental principle of spiritual law. If one cannot accept this aspect of spiritual law, then nothing else really matters. When we talk about spiritual law, we need to first accept this fundamental concept that there is a God, there is a manifestation that reveals its law, and it is plausible that from his vantage point on the twigs of the tree of eternity, that he can see things that we can't see. Baha'u'llah refers to spiritual law in the Atas as not being just a law. He refers to them as being the choice wine. He says, think not that we have revealed unto you a mere code of laws. Rather, we have unsealed the choice wine. Consequently, he's trying to explain to you, don't be so upset at these laws. There's something very, very, very important in them. The next thing I want you to remember is this, is that one should never think, my test that I've been given in this life is greater than your test. Or my test is greater than his test or her test, or their test are greater than mine. We should not assume this. First of all, we don't know what their test is. Secondly, it doesn't matter if your test is greater or not. Everybody has been given their own test. In fact, if your test is greater than theirs, then it's only an indication of your greater spiritual identity. Because we're told that no one is given a test that's beyond their capacity. Therefore, if you're given that test, you have the capacity. Which means that if anything, if you want to go down that road, my test is better than your test kind of thing, which you shouldn't do, then you should just say, I have a higher spiritual destiny. And you can go with that if you And we shouldn't ever discriminate against anyone who has any tests. If someone is afflicted with any temptation, let's say it's gambling, alcohol, drugs, homosexuality, but also any form of heterosexual action. I mean, it's a big test for a lot of people. Take my word for it. And ask Justin. No, I'm kidding. I'm just joking. I'm kidding. I kid Justin. What I'm saying is that there are many tests. Okay, I'm just kidding. I had to pick on somebody.
I love you.
Okay. The point is, we should never be judgmental against anyone. We should be loving because we all have tests. We're just all brothers in being tested, but we're being differently tested. Now, it is my understanding that this is the essence of life. This is the mission that you have been given. Your mission, should you decide to accept it, is to be a spiritual being, dwell in a human body, and overcome all kinds of physical disabilities. And we have this interesting thing related to sex. Sex is an interesting thing because it's one of the tests. It's not the only one. I can assure you money is just as big, and comfort and luxury and backbiting. There's plenty of this. But sex is an interesting one because here we have this situation where all of creation is based on the intercourse of a duality of pairs. You can go in all the plant kingdom, they all have sex. Okay, you can look at all the animals, they have it. You can look even at the atoms and how they form molecules. Go ahead, look at the atoms, how they look at an electron microscope, and you'll see that physical creation is held together by the bonding of atoms turning into molecules, and they do so because of the duality of the negative and positive charged particles, and the opposites attract. In fact, many scientists say that molecules are just atoms having sex. I didn't make that up. I read that in many books. So some people see sex everywhere, from the tiniest atom there. And this is true. This is how God has created all of physical creation, from the tiniest atom. Probably sooner or later they'll find that the nebulas and the galaxies are all doing it as well, in some form, because this is the yin and yang of the universe. So, against this backdrop, the manifestation of God comes. In every age, Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, they come and they say this particular thing can only lawfully be expressed in the human being through the institution of marriage and the institution of heterosexual marriage. And they say this is the way to do it. We're not suppressing it, but we are guiding it and channeling it. Shoghi Effendi says the Bahá'í faith recognizes the value of the sex impulse. It doesn't seek to suppress it, it only seeks its regulation and control. I'm going to read you this quotation. This is from the House of Justice. They say, in considering the effect of obedience to laws on individual lives, one must remember that the purpose of life is to prepare the soul for the next. Here one must learn to control and direct one's animal impulses, not to be a slave to them. Life in this world is a succession of tests and achievements. I'll make that clear. Life in this world is a succession of tests and achievements, of falling short and of making new spiritual advances. And I want everyone to read this, not in terms of homosexuality, but in terms of whatever test they have. Whatever test you have, whether it be gambling or homosexuality or anger or heterosexual infidelity, anything, think of it this way. Life in this world is a succession of tests and achievements, of falling short and of making new spiritual advances. Sometimes the course may seem very hard, but one could witness again and again that the soul, who steadfastly obeys the law of Baha'u'llah, however hard it may seem, grows spiritually. They grow spiritually. Okay, now we have this dichotomy. We're doing physical things, because a lot of this spiritual law, we call it spiritual law because it's part of the soul, but you're doing physical things. And they say when you do those physical things, abstain from certain things in many cases, you grow spiritually. There's some mysterious connection. It says, the soul who steadfastly obeys the law of Baha'u'llah, however hard it may seem, grows spiritually, while the one who compromises with the law for the sake of his own apparent happiness is seen to have been following a chimera, which is a phantom, something that doesn't really exist. He does not attain the happiness he sought. He retards his spiritual advance and often brings new problems upon himself. Now, the best way to think of it is this, is that God gives you tests in your physical makeup, your genetic makeup or your hormonal makeup or some kind of... he gives you these tests because they are good for your soul to overcome. It's not a good thing to do a certain thing, but that certain thing is there to be an obstacle for you to overcome, thereby to grow. The best analogy I can give you is that if you go into a gym and you lifted weights that had no weight at all, you would not develop your muscles. Isn't that right? You wouldn't develop. The harder the weight is, the more the muscle grows. Why is that? We know from science that if you lift a very heavy thing or exert a muscle very hard, you tear the muscle. The muscle tears in little spots. And by that tearing of the muscle, then it's sore the next day, and you all know what that feels like. And then the muscle grows in all of those little torn spots, and the muscle is actually slightly bigger. So you can tear it a little bit more, and in this way you grow. If you go into a gym, you'll see a whole array of machines, and every machine is nothing but an obstacle for you to do something. It's nothing but a way to make some part of physical motion harder. And we value these gyms. We pay money to have membership to go to them every day to put obstacles in our place because we understand the principle that obstacles cause growth into physical muscles. And this is exactly the same thing that we just read in the quote from the House of Justice, that overcoming these obstacles, it's like a spiritual gym. And maybe if you think your test is harder than others, then they just gave you a heavier weight because you're stronger spiritually, perhaps. Now, allied to this concept is the basic Bahá'í teaching that spiritual growth comes through suffering and through testing. Just generally speaking. I'm going to read you a few quotations on that. We don't have to read too many because I guess you know. Abdu'l-Bahá says, the mind and spirit of man advance when he is tried by suffering. The more the ground is plowed, the better the seed will grow. The better the harvest will be. Just as the plow furrows the earth deeply, purifying it of weeds and thistles, so suffering and tribulation free man from the petty affairs of this world until he arrives in a state of complete detachment. His attitude in this world will be that of divine happiness. Man is, so to speak, unripe. The heat of the fire of suffering will mature him. Look back to the times past, and you will find that the greatest men have suffered most. Isn't that interesting? Look back to times of the past, you'll find that the greatest men have suffered most. And I love it that he says the heat of the fire of suffering. If you ever get a chance, go and look at any of the, like those Japanese sword makers that temper steel. I want you to watch that sometime. They take steel that's very weak, you hit something and it becomes the shape of something, and then they put it in the fire. And they forge it, and they take it out, and they put it in the steam, and the steam blows the whole room. And then it's a little stronger, and then they put it in the fire again. And they go back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth, until finally it becomes tempered steel. And it is the strongest steel, because it's been tempered by fire. Fire and cold, and fire and cold, and fire and cold. And Baha'u'llah says, thou art even as a finely tempered sword. He uses the word tempered sword. So, basic analogy, that spiritual growth comes through test and suffering. Abdu'l-Bahá says this, the evolution of the spirit takes place through the plowing up of the soil of the heart, so that it is a constant reflection of the Holy Spirit. In this way, the human spirit grows and develops by leaps and bounds. How many of you want to grow by leaps and bounds spiritually? He says, this is the way. You're going to grow by leaps and bounds through human suffering. And I'm going to read you one more. Men who suffer not attain no perfection. The plant most pruned by the gardeners is that one which, when the summer comes, will have the most beautiful blossoms and the most abundant fruit. The laborer cuts up the earth with his plow, and from that earth comes the rich and plentiful harvest. The more a man is chastened, the greater is the harvest of spiritual virtues shown forth by him. The prayer of the prophets of God has always been, and still is, O God, I long to lay down my life in the path to thee. I desire to shed my blood for thee and to make the supreme sacrifice. So, what I'm trying to explain is this. This is a very interesting analogy Abdu'l-Bahá is making. It's what we call the garden analogy, what I call the garden analogy, because I have found this over and over again, that Abdu'l-Bahá says that in order to control your physical appetites, whether it be in the sexual realm or the material realm or any kind of thing, in order to curb them, you are not trying to suppress them. You're not trying to deny them. It says, the Bahá'í faith recognizes the value of the sex impulse, but condemns its illegitimate and improper expression, such as free love, companionate marriage, and others. The Baha'is do not believe in the suppression of the sex impulse, but in its regulation and control. And this is best expressed in the garden analogy, because Bahá'í says that basically we are like gardens. And if you leave plants just rough, it becomes very wild. But if you tend to the garden, you can make it much purer. I'm going to read this. He says, the mission of the prophets of God has been to train the souls of humanity and free them from the thraldom of natural instincts and physical tendencies. They are like unto gardeners. So he says, the manifestations of God are like unto gardeners. They are like unto gardeners, and the world of humanity is the field of their cultivation. The wilderness, an untrained jungle growth wherein they proceed to labor. So this is a very nice analogy, because he talks about there's a wilderness and a jungle. But if you go into the wilderness and the jungle and refine it, you can bring out the natural beauty of plants. A garden is not a rejection of plants or the jungle. No, it's just a guiding. It's a regulation. It's a control of something that is inherently good, but can be made more beautiful on a higher level through the art of gardening. And all the food you eat, everything that you eat, was originally not very tasty and not very sweet and not very nourishing. If you go back, if you look at the history of science, you'll find that the original carrots were very small and very tiny, and they didn't taste very good, and this and that and this and that. I told you we'd get onto organic gardening sooner or later. You'll find that all of these things were refined. And how beautiful is a garden? Go out to anybody's house that has a beautiful garden and compare that to something that's just been left wild, for years. And you see the difference. And this is what he's saying. A garden is not a rejection of plant nature. It's merely the regulation and control of it to create higher beauty. And this is basically the teaching. That's why I like that analogy. Now, I want to make this very clear. Is it plausible that if there is a God, that perhaps he knows some things that we don't know? If there is a God. Is it not plausible? Is it also necessary that a child always needs to understand everything the parent says before they will do it? Is it necessary? Isn't it occasionally necessary that the child has to accept what the parent says, and maybe they can, like say the child says, well, I want to eat 10 gallons of chocolate ice cream. And it may be difficult for the parent to explain the nature of the human digestive system and the assimilation of the sugar molecule and so on. It may not be possible for the parent to explain all of that, so they have to say no. They just have to say, don't do that. We have to accept this plausibility first as part of spiritual law before we have any framework for discussion on the issue of homosexuality. This is a framework. If you're not in that framework, then we're talking at two different ends of Teilhard de Chardin's duality. One is talking about man's physical nature, and where they're talking from that frame of reference, and others talking about spiritual nature, and never the twain shall meet. And so basically, religion is in conflict because they're talking about the spiritual nature. We have to look to our spiritual nature if we're going to understand this. We have to look at the right place. I remember when my son was first born, when he just first came out, and the doctor looked at him and looked at me, and he said, he looks exactly like his father. And my wife pointed to the baby and said, yes, but you're looking at the wrong end. This is what sometimes we're doing when we look at human nature. We're looking at the wrong end. Instead of looking at the top, we're looking at the bottom. And this is the whole point of spiritual law, that you have to look at the other end. The other thing that spiritual law teaches us is that we should not feel guilty or think that there's something wrong with us if we have physical imperfections. If we have any form of cravings that are prohibited in religious law, it should not make us feel that there's something abnormal or wrong about us. No, quite to the contrary. There's something quite normal about us, because all of us are given this. We're told in the writings we're given. There's nothing wrong with having it. There should be no guilt associated with it. Rather, our response should be, yes, I've been given this just like I've been given a weight machine in the gym. I don't feel guilty about that. I don't feel wrong about that. Now let's get to work on spiritual development. There's a principle I find in the Bahá'í writings which I term the principle of divine irony. I call it the principle of divine irony. I don't find that term in the actual writings, but I see many statements that have irony, and I find it interesting. And basically I define divine irony as this. Many times we're told that if you give up something on the physical level, on the physical plane, you will receive exactly the same thing on the spiritual plane. You will get whatever you give up physically, a much greater spiritual equivalent of that you will gain. And I've found maybe 10 or 15 of these. For example, there's a hidden word that says, "Be not content with the ease of a passing day, and deprive not thyself of everlasting rest." And so there, that's an irony, because he's saying that if you want to laze around, in the physical world, then you're going to lose everlasting rest. It's not a good deal. It's just not a good deal. But it's interesting that exactly the thing that you go for in this life, you lose in the next life. And he says that pride debaseth you, which is an irony. He says humility exalts you. In the Bible we have, it says, the first shall be last and the last shall be first, or the meek shall inherit the earth. And as I thought about this, I realized that the tests that you're given in this life may have something to do with your true spiritual identity. Whatever test you are given in this life, whatever craving you're given in this life, maybe you were given that because your true identity is to love that thing on the physical level first, then to let go of it and to gain it in a higher level. That perhaps this is part of your unique identity. Whatever test you've been given is your unique test because you have the capacity to gain that on a spiritual level. Now, this is what I think. I think that all physical cravings and desires are nothing but training wheels. They're nothing but training wheels. Because Bahá'í has said that any physical desire or craving teaches you something about the spiritual equivalent of it. He says, for example, if you didn't see wealth, if money didn't exist and wealth didn't exist, how would you know that God is wealthy? You just wouldn't know. It just wouldn't exist. It would be like a color that you've never seen before. If you didn't know about physical wealth, how would you know about spiritual wealth? And he says in the same way, if you didn't know about physical comfort, how would you know about spiritual comfort? In other words, physical things are desires and cravings that teach you about things that then you can understand the spiritual concept. And if you didn't have this, you wouldn't know anything. The physical world is kind of a representation of that. So I was thinking, then all of these physical cravings and desires, whether it be for sex or for money or for comfort or power or glory, all these things teach us how these are nice things. But we want the spiritual equivalent of it, and we want to let go. Because they did their job. They were just training wheels. They were training wheels to teach us what it was, and then we let it go. If you could talk to a training wheel, if one could talk, the training wheel would say, my goal, my highest aspiration is to be not needed. My goal is to be discarded, because I did my job then. And so this is what I call divine irony. And it's a very interesting concept. The basic expression of divine irony, the highest form of it, comes from the manifestations of God, because they sacrifice things in order to give the very same things they sacrificed to mankind. Let me read you this passage from Bahá'í. This is a passage that also illustrates divine irony. The ancient beauty have consented to be bound with chains, that mankind may be released from its bondage. That's the irony. He gave up that thing, he says, and hath accepted to be made a prisoner within this most mighty stronghold, that the whole world may attain unto true liberty. He hath drained to its dregs the cup of sorrow, that all peoples of the earth may attain unto abiding joy. See how he expresses everything in terms of irony. That the manifestation of God gives up the very things on the physical level so that we can obtain them on a spiritual level. This is also what we're called to do. We're called to give up certain physical things to a certain extent, not totally, to give them up to a certain extent so that we can gain them on a spiritual level. The ultimate divine irony, of course, is martyrdom. Martyrdom is the ultimate divine irony because you're giving up your very life and thereby obtaining spiritual life. Now, there are a number of concepts that I want to just talk about that exist in the world that are not true according to Baha'u'llah. One of them is the concept that freedom and liberty are the highest ideal to which man can attain. It's embedded throughout our culture that liberty and freedom are the highest thing. They're right up there. Nothing can be higher than that. But Baha'u'llah says this. He says, we find some men desiring liberty and priding themselves therein. Such men are in the depths of ignorance. Liberty must in the end lead to sedition, whose flames none can quench. Thus warneth you he who is the reckoner, the all-knower. Know ye that the embodiment of liberty and its symbol is the animal. That which beseemeth man is submission unto such restraints as will protect him from his own ignorance and guard him against the harm of the mischief maker. Liberty causeth man to overstep the bounds of propriety and to infringe on the dignity of his station. It debaseth him to the level of extreme depravity and wickedness. Say, true liberty consisteth in man's submission unto my command. And there's another divine irony. Is that not divine irony? True liberty, spiritual liberty, consisteth in man's submission unto my commandments. You say, no, that's not liberty, that's the opposite of liberty. No, there's two kinds of liberty. There's true liberty, which is part of this side, and there is physical liberty, and he says, true liberty consisteth in man's submission unto my commandments, little as ye know it. Were men to observe that which we have sent down to them from the heaven of revelation, they would of a certainty attain unto perfect liberty. So there are many other aspects to spiritual law. And you know what? I'm not going to read them all. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You know what? I'm not going to read them all because I want to go on. There's some more things I want to say. But if we could talk about that, because spiritual law is a very important subject. What I want to go on to now is to point out that throughout history, spiritual law has been given by the various religions, and there have been inappropriate expressions of spiritual law. There have been ways in which religions have promoted or expressed spiritual law that are wrong or inappropriate. And the reason I can say this with authority is that Shoghi Effendi himself, in Advent of Divine Justice, when he talks about chastity and holy life and morality, he devotes a whole paragraph to say, let there be no mistake. The Bahá'í teachings on this subject should not be confused or associated with certain other philosophies. And he mentions some of those. One of them, he says, asceticism. Another, he says, I'm going to read it, he does not be associated or confused with any form of asceticism or of excessive and bigoted Puritanism. Excessive and bigoted Puritanism. If you look up what that means, bigoted Puritanism means that you consider yourself superior and others inferior because they don't follow those teachings. And Shoghi Effendi says we cannot even be associated, let alone confused, with that kind of philosophy. Throughout history, spiritual law has been used in the name of judgmentalism, in the name of the oppression of women. In many cultures throughout the world, women have been oppressed in the name of spiritual law, in the prohibition of the arts, and there have been so many ways in which spiritual law has been inappropriately expressed. But the greatest way in which it's inappropriately expressed is in judgmentalism. It's thinking that someone else is inferior to you because they are not obeying that. I actually wrote down here there are 8 different ways that we can inappropriately express spiritual law, and I'm not going to read those now, but later on we could do that. Now, the House of Justice says, and let's kind of move in now to the issue of homosexuality. We've been looking at the forest, now let's look at the trees a little bit. The House of Justice said that there's a fundamental difference between people that are dealing with this issue and Baha'is. One of them is what I call the big distinction. I call it the big distinction. The House of Justice says it this way. It is important to understand that there is a difference between the Baha'i attitude toward, on the one hand, the condition of homosexuality and those who are affected by it, and on the other, the practice of homosexual relations by members of the Baha'i community. They're making a distinction between the condition of homosexuality and those that have that condition, and the actual physical expression of it. They say these are 2 different things. Now, if you talk to those in the non-Baha'i world that are championing gay rights, they do not like this quotation. I've had plenty of conversations with them. In fact, recently I even called the editor of LGBT Nation, the largest gay publication in the world, And I wanted to talk to him because he's writing a book against the Baha'i faith on this particular issue. And so I wanted to ask him what his attitude was for this particular distinction, because it's interesting to me. He says, no, we do not see that distinction. He says, no, if someone is homosexual or gay, and they have that predilection or they have that inclination, they must express it. The two are married. The expression of it, they are gay. And gay means that they express it. The House of Justice says, no, we have to have a difference. And the difference becomes very, very important because we have a certain teachings that are opposed to this side, the expression of it. But we have no judgment or hatred or shame to those on this side. This is a very important issue because sometimes we inappropriately express hatred to this side. And that's just wrong. It's not going to help. It's not going to help us. It's not going to help anybody else. Another thing that we find differences in the non-Baha'i world, and I know that all of us are Baha'is here, but I still want to point these out. The difference is that many people in the non-Baha'i world take offense at the language contained in the writings of Shoghi Effendi and the Universal House of Justice. The language seems very, very strong, and it appears to them to be judgmental, prejudicial, homophobic, if you want to use that word. And they take offense at language. I don't like dwelling on language too much, but I want to mention a few words that are of particular disdain to those in the world. And I want to talk about the meaning of these words. One of the words is the phrase spiritually condemned. I don't know if you've seen this phrase. It's in the letter from Shoghi Effendi. I'll read it to you. He says this: homosexuality, according to the writings of Baha'u'llah, is spiritually condemned. And so you'll see many people, they talk to me and say, how can you dare say that? You're condemning me as a person. Well, they're not seeing the big distinction, and they're missing the key word. It's spiritually. Don't look at the word condemned. It's the spiritually part of it that's important. Physically, that's not the law. This is a spiritual law. This is part of the dual nature of man. This is part of spiritual law. This is a spiritual thing. If you want to look at the physical side of man, it's not condemned. Science can prove that. You can look in the world, and those that practice homosexuality, whether they be humans or animals or plants, and they all do to a certain extent, it doesn't harm them. So it's not physically condemned. It's a spiritual law. And so when they take offense at the phrase spiritually condemned, say, look at the word spiritual. This is part of spiritual law. This is the framework. That's one thing. Another statement I find that they take offense at is the statement that homosexuality is, quote, a distortion of human nature. I get really mad at this. Believe me, I have plenty of friends. I have many Baha'i friends. I have not many. I have dozens and dozens of gay Baha'i friends, and they don't like this phrase, distortion of nature. I'm going to read it to you. It is clear from the teaching of Baha'u'llah that homosexuality is not a condition to which a person should be reconciled, but is a distortion of his or her nature which should be controlled or overcome. And I think about this and I say, Shoghi Effendi and the House of Justice are very clear about words. And if you think about distortion, you realize that distortion, when you distort something, you are not negating it. You are not rejecting it. You are merely just overemphasizing some part of it. In other words, when you distort something, there is something natural and good in it. It's just been exaggerated or overemphasized. Like if you look at a Cubist painting or a Picasso painting, and the nose is distorted. Okay? But a person does have a nose. So you have your true nose, your true self, but it can be distorted. So to view it as a distortion means that you're not rejecting it. You're just trying to regulate it and control it. So actually the term distortion can be very helpful. The last terminology, and I don't want to really get into the Baha'i quotes because I know you've all read them, but some people take offense at the term handicap or affliction. Have you ever read the term handicap or affliction in the Baha'i writings? And they get really mad. They say, how can you dare refer to this as handicap and affliction? And this was such an important question that the House of Justice was asked this themselves. Somebody wrote to the House and complained about this terminology. I'll read you what they said. you mention recent research which indicates that there may be a genetic basis for homosexuality. You accept the Baha'i view on this matter, but you question the use of such terms as abnormality, handicap, affliction, problem, etc., since they can create misunderstandings. On the contrary, the House of Justice feels that such words can be a great help to the individual concerned. Human beings suffer from many problems, both physical and psychological. Some are the result of individuals' own behavior, some are caused by circumstances in which they grew up, some are congenital. So basically they're pointing out that these are helpful words, because if one views that we all have problems, and some are congenital. They point out that some you could be inherited or born with. They say it's helpful for you to understand that these are just like an illness. There should be no guilt, there should be no shame. It's a useful framework or paradigm from which to look at it. Now, I want to make something really clear. There is no hierarchy of Baha'i sins. There is no hierarchy that says one sin is worse than another, that this one is worse than another. I know some people, they like to think this. Some people go out there and say, this is the worst sin, and we have to do everything in the world to eliminate it, not just from ourselves, but from everybody else. But there is no hierarchy of Baha'i sins. If there were the Academy Awards of human faults, and if they were to say the nominees are, backbiting and fault-finding and, materialism and so on, homosexuality, and someone says, it's not going to win. It just isn't going to win. It's not even close. Look at some of the statements of Baha'u'llah. He says the most hateful characteristic of man is fault-finding. He says, of all men, the most negligent is he that disputeth idly with his man. I mean, there are many statements that are going to win that Academy Award. But there's no hierarchy. And it is completely wrong to single out any particular weakness or predilection that anyone has over and above anything else. We should all remember that we have one, or two, or three, or whatever. And so I want to interrupt this talk to bring you a newsflash. I need to interrupt it right now, bring you a newsflash. And that newsflash is nobody's perfect. Just get that in your head right now. Nobody's perfect. Casey, you are not perfect. Okay? I'm sorry, I had to tell you. And so the point is that you're not perfect. None of us are perfect. And we all, in humility, must understand this. If everybody were perfect, Baha'u'llah wouldn't have needed to come. He wouldn't have come. The world is engulfed in all forms of imperfections. This is why he has come. So we shouldn't be surprised that he or she or you or me have imperfections. Newsflash, we're all imperfect. But this is the path to our spiritual growth. The imperfections are our means to spiritual growth. Now, I want to read you a few quotations regarding what should be our attitude towards those who are gay. Okay? He says this. These are all from the House of Justice or Shoghi Effendi. Quote, "To regard homosexuals with prejudice and disdain would be entirely against the spirit of Baha'i teachings." Let me read that again. To regard homosexuals with prejudice and disdain would be entirely against the spirit of Baha'i teachings. So that's pretty clear. Here's another quotation. This is from the Universal House of Justice. "This law is no reason for Baha'is to consider homosexuals as outcasts. If they are not Baha'is, there is no reason to expect them to obey the Baha'i law in this respect any more than we would expect a non-Baha'i to abstain from drinking alcohol." Another statement, and this is also from the House of Justice. "The doors are open for all of humanity to enter the cause of God, irrespective of their circumstances. This invitation applies to homosexuals as well as to others who are engaged in practices contrary to the Baha'i teachings. Associated with this invitation is the expectation that all believers will make a sincere and persistent effort to eradicate those aspects of their conduct which are not in conformity to divine law." Here's another quote. This is from Shoghi Effendi. He says they, and he's referring to homosexuals, he says they should be treated just like any other people seeking admittance to the faith. and be accepted on the same basis. Our teachings, as outlined in Advent Divine Justice on the subject of a chaste and holy life, should be emphasized to them just as to every other applicant. But certainly no ruling whatsoever should be laid down on this matter. The Baha'is have certainly not yet reached the stage of moral perfection where they are in a position to too harshly scrutinize the private lives of other souls, and each individual should be accepted on the basis of his faith and sincere willingness to try to live up to the divine standards. Further than this we cannot go at present. Now, how do we deal with people or talk to people on this issue, whether they be Baha'is that are dealing with it or non-Baha'is? And I want to mention just a few basic principles. I hope I won't go too long, but I'll just mention a few principles and then we can open it up for discussion. The first basic principle is that we are told, as Baha'is, to only see the good in people. To only see the good in people. That everybody has faults. We got that newsflash. Now, forget about it. Think of every person as a glass of water that's partially full and partially empty. Look at that glass of water and it's got a certain amount of water. I don't know what the percentage is. Maybe it's half full, half empty. Doesn't matter. The point is only look at the water. The water is the good part of them. And ignore the empty part of the glass. If I gave you a glass, let's say I had a glass of Coke. Let's say I had an empty glass and I put just, a few drops of Coke in the bottom and I hand it to you. I would not say, here is a glass of 7/8 emptiness. I would still say it contains a little bit of Coke because I'm only focusing on that. If we learn to do that, we will not see any imperfection in any human being because the imperfection doesn't exist. It's just like if you look at the stars at night and you see the stars in the blackness, we ignore the blackness, we just look at the stars. And we're told something interesting. Whenever we look at the water in the glass, we are seeing God. Because all goodness is God. So every time you look for the water in somebody, you are seeing God. Everybody's a little glass of God. This is the first basic principle of how you deal with someone. The second principle in dealing with anyone is that we're told that humility is the prime quality in teaching. I want to read to you one quotation about how to teach the faith. It's very interesting. It comes from the book The Light of Hearts by Haydar Ali. And he spent a lot of time with Baha'u'llah and he wrote his memoirs. And basically Baha'u'llah tells us how we should teach. It's exactly how we should deal with anyone when confronting this issue. Okay, and he says this. He says he went into the mansion of Bahá'í and Baha'u'llah began to speak. And he said this: a kindly approach and loving behavior towards people are the first requirements for teaching. Now, isn't that interesting? A kindly approach and loving behavior are the first requirements. He didn't say knowledge or wisdom or information or what facts to say or how to answer what question. He didn't say those are the first requirements. He says a kindly approach and loving behavior towards people are the first requirements. Sometimes people will ask me, they say, well, how do we answer this question? Or what do we say? And I say, well, actually, that's already the wrong question. It's already the wrong question according to Advaita. It's not what you say, it's how you act. That's the first thing. Then he goes on to say this: the teacher must carefully listen to whatever a person has to say, even though his talk may consist only of vain imaginings and blind repetitions of the opinions of others. Anytime you talk to anyone this issue, do what Baha'u'llah says first. Listen first. Listen first. Always seek to understand before seeking to be understood. He says the teacher must carefully listen to whatever a person has to say, even though his talk may consist only of vain imaginings and blind repetitions of others. One should not resist or engage in argument. The teacher must avoid disputes which will end in stubborn refusal or hostility, because the other person will feel overpowered and defeated. Therefore, he will be more inclined to reject the cause. One should rather say, maybe you are right, but kindly consider the question from this other point of view. Consideration, respect, and love encourage people to listen and do not force them to respond with hostility. This is so interesting because, first of all, he's saying that every teacher must have the DNA of a good teacher. I call it the DNA of a good teacher. I always say that to myself, DNA, because you must have the DNA of a good teacher. And what is DNA? What does it stand for? It stands for do not argue. That's what Baha'u'llah said. That do not argue is the DNA of a good teacher according to Baha'u'llah. That's the first principle. Secondly, he says, rather than confronting or arguing with them, invite them to see it through a different frame of reference. He says, consider the question from this point of view. And this is another very important principle in life, that everybody is right according to their own frame of reference. There's nobody that's wrong. Everybody is right from their point of view, from their frame. Why would they be otherwise? So the point is that you have to say whatever he thinks or believes, he's right from his frame of reference. It logically follows then that you cannot change someone's opinion of something, but you can change their frame of reference, and thereby their opinion will automatically change. And this is the fundamental principle he's saying. He says, consider this from another point of view. He goes on to say, they are convinced because they see that your purpose is not to defeat them, but to convey truth, to manifest courtesy, and to show forth heavenly attributes. This will encourage the people to be fair. Their spiritual natures will respond, and by the bounty of God, they will find themselves recreated. Isn't this a fascinating treatise on human relations? Then he goes into this very interesting part of this, in which he refers to Abdu'l-Baha. This is Baha'u'llah talking, and yet he says, now, consider the way in which Abdu'l-Baha teaches. Baha'u'llah could have just told us how to teach, but for some reason he desired to hold up Abdu'l-Baha as an example, because that was Abdu'l-Baha's role, so we could see this. And he says this, consider the way in which the master teaches the people. He listens very carefully to the most hollow and senseless talk. He listens so intently that the speaker says to himself, he is trying to learn from me. Then the master gradually and very carefully, by means that the other person does not perceive, puts him on the right path and endows him with a fresh power of understanding. Isn't that interesting? Listening is the first step in dealing with anyone on this issue. Listen intently. You will learn a lot from these people, from all peoples. Never argue, always listen. That's one of the main principles. The next thing I should point out to you is that you need to demonstrate to them that you genuinely love them and you genuinely care for them. This is the first thing you have to express. You know, there's an old saying that says, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. I know it's a corny old cliche. I've heard it said 1,000 times. But it's very, very true. Nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And the point is this, is that every time you open your mouth, think about what of those two is coming out of my mouth right now. Am I trying to show them how much I know? Or am I trying to let them know how much I care? And through that filtration system, let's see if we can do a whole lot more of this first than the second. Too often, we are trying so hard to tell people what we know. And in reality, that doesn't work. They can figure out the truth. The most important thing is to love them and to listen to them. The next general principle that I find in the Baha'i writing about how to deal with people is that we're told to always try to make people happy. Always try to make people happy and never cause anyone grief. This is the most fundamental teaching of Abdu'l-Baha. Over and over again, you'll find if you study his talks and his travels that was the only thing he was concerned about. Was somebody happy? Are you happy? How can I make it? If people are unhappy, he can't rest. Baha'u'llah said he could not even sleep one night, knowing that even one soul was hurt by him. Now, in this regard then, if we're not allowed to make people unhappy, and we have to make people happy, you have to remember that you cannot offend someone in any greater way than to diminish their sense of self-worth. There is no way you can make someone more unhappy than to diminish their sense of self-worth. You can criticize them in many ways. You can say they're ugly, you don't like their shoes, you don't like their clothes, their mother is ugly, I don't know, you can say lots of things. But none of them are as bad as diminishing their sense of self-worth. This is so fundamental. And this is the first thing you have to look at people, that they are worthy. They have water in the glass, and you see that water in the glass, and you point that out. Now you may say, am I talking about how to teach homosexuals? Yes, of course I am. Is this teaching 101? Yes, of course it is, because it's the same thing. But maybe because we're struggling, as Rain said, to deal with people and talking with you, maybe it should cause us to go back and look at what are the general principles of how to teach and how to deal with others. The next principle I find is the principle of kindliness. That we're told somehow that kindliness has a magic power. I say magic because there's a passage that we all read, it's in the Ruhi books. It said there's 4 analogies to a kindly tongue. 4 analogies in one. He says a kindly tongue is the lodestone of the hearts of men. It is the bread of the spirit. What else? Clothes the word with meaning. Yes. Okay, so fountain. So he's comparing it to a magnet. A lodestone is a magnet. He's comparing it to food. Bread is a food. He's comparing it to clothes. Clothes cover something. He's comparing it to water or a fountain. But it's very interesting because kindliness, it has all those powers. This is great. Because what is a magnet? It attracts. Okay, and he says kindliness attracts their hearts. Next, he says it is like food. It is the bread of the spirit. It's something that you feed them with. It's not the facts. It's not the knowledge. It's not the information. The bread is the kindness. Then he says it clotheth the words with meaning. So he's saying that the words have no meaning. They have no meaning without spoken with kindness. And yet so often I watch a movie and stuff, and at the end of the movie, the main hero, he tells somebody like it is. Have you noticed that? And they tell it with force and without any, and then everybody claps and all stuff. It doesn't happen that way in real life. In real life, they get punched in the face. Okay, but somehow we've been taught to say that if we have a truth, express it with force. And we think thereby we're giving the words more meaning. We're doing the exact opposite. We're taking the meaning away. We're taking the clothing of meaning off the words. This is what Baha'u'llah says. And then he compares it to a fountain of waters. You cannot get 4 bigger analogies than that. And Baha'u'llah he just throws the book of analogies at kindliness. So clearly kindliness is important. Now, there's a statement that I read in which they say that we must always give those involved in this homosexual issue, we must give them wholehearted love and acceptance. Wholehearted love and acceptance. How many people do you know, Baha'i and non-Baha'i, who are dealing with the gay issue do not feel wholehearted love and acceptance? I know, I've talked to dozens of them. They do not feel this, and yet we are told here in our Baha'i writings that they must have wholehearted, not half-hearted, didn't say half-hearted love, wholehearted love and acceptance. But they make an interesting point. They seem to imply that some of us think that if we give love and acceptance to those that are dealing with the issue of homosexuality, if we give love and acceptance, then we are thereby approving of homosexuality. In other words, they are not buying in to the big distinction. The big distinction is that we have a certain attitude towards people and the condition, and a different attitude towards the practice of it. And so sometimes we think we are serving the Baha'i teachings or the Christian teachings or the Muslim teachings by withholding love or acceptance to people. Thereby we're enforcing some spiritual law. That's not our job. It's not our job. Our job is to give wholehearted love. I'm going to read this. And they say, the essence of the Baha'i position on this subject does not have to do with judgment about individuals or about evidence pertaining to social consequences. The House of Justice urges you to avoid dwelling on any conflicted thoughts or emotions which you may experience and continue to demonstrate wholehearted love and acceptance towards your daughter. In this case, they're telling the person to have love and acceptance towards their daughter. And then they say, such an attitude does not in any way imply agreement with her actions. See, this is the big distinction. Wholehearted love and acceptance, that doesn't imply that you agree with their actions. In the same way that if somebody was, say, suffering from cancer, and if I were to give them love and sympathy and acceptance, that doesn't mean I'm pro-cancer. It doesn't mean I'm pro-cancer. Far from it. It means quite the opposite. The important thing to remember is that spiritual law is for me and me alone, for myself and my behavior. Spiritual law is only for us. We are not in the business of trying to force others to obey the Baha'i laws. We're not in the business of trying to force non-Baha'is to obey the Baha'i laws, or even Baha'is, because this is just not our job. Our job is to lead people as best we can to the manifestation of God. We can lead the horse to water, but it's not our job to make the horse drink. The horse can drink or not. Baha'u'llah says, whosoever desireth, let him turn aside from this counsel. And whosoever desireth, let him choose the path to his Lord. It's not our job. Baha'u'llah didn't come to the world to rid it of homosexuality. He didn't come to the world to rid it of alcoholism. He didn't come to rid it of any of these one things. He came to bring the world to spirituality and to God. And that is a path. So he says, whosoever desireth, let him turn aside from this counsel. Whosoever desireth, let him choose the path to his Lord. And the first part of choosing that path is to accept three things. Accept these three things, and then you can start walking that path. One, that there is a God. Two, that God perhaps knows more than we know, and he knows what's good for us. And three, that he has spoken to us through his manifestations. Accept those three things, and then now you can get on that path and you can walk that and you can explore this. If one doesn't accept those three premises, there's nothing else really matters. And I'm certainly not going to argue with anybody about it. All I want to talk about is these three things. That is the path. Then you get on the path and you can walk that path. And he doesn't say on the top of the Ahmad, whosoever desires, let him stop being gay. He doesn't say, whosoever desires, let him stop drinking alcohol. He doesn't say this. Furthermore, he tells us, do not be concerned with the faults of others, so long as thou art thyself a sinner. You've read this. Is there any place in the hidden words where he says, be not concerned with the sins of others, except when they're homosexual? Can someone find that for me in the writings? Or anything else? No, be not concerned. So all we are concerned with is guiding someone to the path. What they do on that path is up to them. Give them a spiritual frame of reference. This Taylor de Chardin, this is what Baha'u'llah said to do. When you teach, give them a spiritual frame of reference. Now, I want to finish pretty soon. There are some teachings in the Baha'i faith, some, not much, but there's some that actually counsel us how we can overcome this problem. If we have this particular predilection, as science will call it, or homosexuality, or we are gay, we are born with it, it's a test, whatever you want to accept, there are ways to deal with it in the Baha'i writings. There are certain things, not much, but there are certainly signposts, and these signposts open the way. The first thing is to remember that when I talk about these things, I am not preaching. And when anybody else talks about it, they're not preaching, because spiritual law is for us and us alone. Anytime we think about the faults of other people, anytime we look at the fault of another person, we are inherently hypocritical. Anytime you even think or even notice the fault of another person, that action in and of itself is inherently hypocritical because you have faults. And Baha'u'llah made this very clear. You know, we associate the finding of faults in others with hypocrisy. Would you agree? At any time somebody goes around preaching, we always think, oh, he's probably does protest too much. I remember Woody Allen, the comedian, he was talking about pornographic movies, and he was saying, how bad they were. And he said, those pornographic movies, they are disgusting. They're so badly lit. And because he was making fun of hypocrisy. Do you understand? Is that people, when they state the fault of others, all they do is draw attention to their own faults. And Baha'u'llah actually said that. He said, magnify not the faults of others, that thine own faults may not appear great. Any time you see the fault of another person, Baha'u'llah tells you what to do. What do you do when you see the fault? Let's say you accidentally look at the air and in the glass and not the water. Okay, we're told to only look at the water in the glass. But say someone walks in, oops, darn it all. I looked at the empty part and I didn't look at the good part of the glass. I made a mistake. Okay, Baha'u'llah tells you what to do in that case. What do you do anytime you see the faults of somebody? What do? You think of your own faults. You say, thank you very much. You reminded me of my own faults, and you just turn it right back on yourself. This is what he says. And he says, how couldst thou forget thine own faults and busy thyself with the faults of others? So I want to make this very, very clear, because I'm about to go into some teachings that are in the Bahá'í writings about what we can do to overcome this. I want to make it clear that I am not preaching. And this is not coming from me. You're going to have to take that with Baha'u'llah. Nobody likes people that preach and tell other people what to do in terms of spiritual law. I remember there was one scene once you saw where there was a preacher giving a sermon in the church, and it was on hellfire and damnation of all the people that don't live up to the moral teachings of God. And he gave this big hellfire and damnation speech, and in the end he finished his sermon by saying, and I say unto every one of you here today, to up your standards. To which the congregation all replied back in unison, up yours. Because this is what happens. This is what happens when you preach to other people. Nobody likes to be preached to. I remember when in my younger day I was a bit of a fanatic Baha'i. I hate to mention this, but it's my fault. And so sometimes I would be a little overzealous and teach the faith to people who weren't ready, and I would say lots of things. And one time I said some Baha'i teachings, and somebody was so mad at them that he insulted me personally. He didn't insult Baha'u'llah, he didn't insult the Baha'i faith, he insulted me personally. I thought, what a crazy attitude that by preaching something, you draw attack onto yourself. In fact, he addressed me using one of the few phrases that begins with son of that's not found in the hidden words. He didn't call me a son of being or a son of spirit. Okay, I'll leave it to you. And I thought this is so interesting that when you preach, you draw attention to your own faults. So I just want to make this clear. That's just preliminary, because people don't like to be preached to. But the first principle, if you want to overcome this problem, is to understand that overcoming any physical craving or desire, no matter what it is, overcoming anyone is more learning what to say yes to than what to say no to. In other words, it's not so much what you have to give up, but what other thing you have to do. I'm going to read you a quotation from the House of Justice on this subject, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit. The House of Justice is writing to someone who has a sexual problem. And it wasn't homosexuality in this case. It actually was the problem of masturbation, believe it or not. And there's a very interesting letter, and I don't want to read the whole thing. But this person having real problems with it, so they wrote, on the issue of masturbation, how do we deal with it? And this is what they write back. They say, your problem, therefore, is one against which you should continue to struggle with determination and with the aid of prayer. You should remember, however, that it is only one of the many temptations and faults that a human being must strive to overcome during his lifetime. And you should not increase the difficulty you have by overemphasizing its importance. We suggest you try to see it within the whole spectrum of the qualities that a Baha'i must develop in his character. Be vigilant against temptation, but do not allow it to claim too great a share of your attention. You should concentrate rather on the virtues that you should develop, the services you should strive to render, and above all, on God and his attributes. This is very interesting. They say, rather than focusing on the thing you shouldn't do, focus on God and his attributes. In other words, sometimes when you focus on something, it only makes it worse. If I tell you right now, whatever you do, don't think of pink elephants. I said, you're going to think of pink elephants. Go on, don't think of pink elephants. You can't do it. Dwelling on something is not necessarily the way to get rid of it. Rather, there has to be light in relation to darkness. And this is a very interesting thing, because all human imperfections are like darkness. And think about this. When you can walk into a dark room and someone will say, turn on the lights. But you never hear them say, turn off the darkness. They don't say turn off the darkness, because they know you can't turn off darkness. No. You turn light on, and darkness automatically disappears as a consequence. This is a fundamental principle that sometimes to eliminate something, you don't focus on attacking it, you focus on the other thing that is its light in relation to its darkness. And this is what the House of Justice says. Now, it so happens that we know what the light switch is. It is gazing on the beauty of God. That's why they say, above all, God and his attributes. Because it says in the Kitabiyatas, observe my commandments for love of my beauty. That's what he says. He says, this is the reason, the motive why you obey his laws. Not for fear, not for shame, not for ostracism, not guilt. These are not the reasons why we obey. We obey for love of God's beauty. Therefore, he's giving us a clue. That is what is the switch. You don't look for the off switch of homosexuality. You look for the on switch of spirituality. You look for the on switch of the love of God. I want to mention a very interesting principle of the on switch. And this comes from a story that I read not too long ago. It's about Abdu'l-Baha. I'm going to finish with this. Abdu'l-Baha always saw only the good in people. And when he wanted to correct their behavior, he looked for their on switch. He didn't try and look for their off switch. You can see this. And a good example of this is that it says, it was some years before, when Abdu'l-Baha was in Paris, that a group of men from Tehran came to him deeply troubled. They had walked all the way from their homes in Persia, since traveling on foot was the only way to meet the master, to make what they considered a most vital request. In a village, there was a Bahá'í who was causing a great deal of trouble because of the lies he told. He lied about everything, with the result that misunderstandings, distrust, and confusion reigned. This dreadful situation, Abdu'l-Baha, they begged, he has to do something about it. And they begged him to write a letter to this believer who was lying about them. So Abdu'l-Baha said, okay, I'll write a letter to the believer. And the letter begins with these words. O thou great lover of truth. And then it goes on with that. And this is fascinating. Abdu'l-Baha looked at the good in that person. That person had the love of truth. And he knew that was his on switch. He didn't try to attack all the lies in his behavior. He didn't even see it, even though it was reported to him. He saw the good in that person. He tried to flip that switch. Isn't that a beautiful story? And this is how Abdu'l-Baha dealt with people. And so this is how we can deal with it ourselves. Sometimes we need to look to our on switch. The next thing I want to point out is that some people will think that say that the Baha'i faith believes, like Christians, that you can pray away the gay. I know you've heard that concept, pray away the gay, and it's viewed with great disdain. There's a lot of scientific research that shows that it doesn't work to any significant extent, even within the Christian community. And then they attack the Baha'i faith because the Baha'is believe that you should pray away the gay. I want to make this clear. The Baha'i faith does not teach that. The Baha'i faith does not teach that. Some people will also say that the Baha'i faith teaches that through doctors you can be cured or of this particular. The Baha'i faith does not teach that. Okay? It doesn't teach that. Some people also say that the Baha'i faith teaches that homosexuality is a choice and it's not inbuilt. It's not inherent. I do not find any statement of the Baha'i writings to confirm that. I find a few statements from the House of Justice in which they say it may or may not be, but they say it may well be. And furthermore, we know from science that a certain portion of homosexuality definitely has a physical component. We know this, but the Baha'i faith says it doesn't matter if it's genetic, it doesn't matter if it wasn't a choice, you still have to deal with it. It's a moot point as far as Baha'i is concerned. But why do I say the Baha'i teachings do not say that you can pray the gay away or that doctors can cure it? It's because of this statement from Shoghi Effendi. He says, and this is in a letter to a Baha'i that wrote to him that was dealing with the subject, he says, quote, through the advice and help of doctors, through a strong and determined effort, and through prayer, a soul can overcome this handicap. So he's not saying you can solve it with one thing or the other. He's saying that through a combination of three things. It's like a tripod that it rests upon, and you need all three. So this is very important, because one without the other is not going to succeed. There is great wisdom in the statement from Shoghi Effendi, because first of all, when he talks about a strong and determined effort. A lot of us think that we just want to find a cure or not, and if it's easy, I'll do it. But if it's hard, I don't want to do it. And he says, no, effort, a strong and determined effort is an essential component. So you need to have that. Secondly, he says prayer is an essential component, but it is not the soul. In fact, in all matters of health, prayer is not sufficient. If you go and read the Bahá'í writings on healing, he'll say that prayer is an essential component, but we shouldn't rely on prayer alone. We must also rely on science. And in other words, we have a dual approach. So why would it not be in this case? That prayer is an essential component, but it is not the only thing. Now, when you say the advice and help of doctors, when Shoghi Effendi wrote that, medical science was really in the Dark Ages. It was really in the Dark Ages. Basically, medical science wasn't even dealing too much with this issue. It was more psychology. It was the Freudians were dealing with it. But Shoghi Effendi now looks like he was way ahead of his time, because the realm of homosexuality has been largely, the baton has been handed over to the scientific and medical community. And we are discovering all kinds of things, not just about this, but about alcoholism and aggression and addiction and all kinds of other things. So when Shoghi Effendi shows his faith in science, that science in combination with prayer and effort can overcome this problem, we need to understand that this is the divine guidance, that we need to apply those three. And you may say, well, maybe I haven't applied a balance of those three. And then I found another statement in which he said that one must struggle and struggle again in relation to this issue. I'm going to read it to you. He says, all I can tell you is this is the end of the same letter. He says that it is forbidden by Baha'u'llah, and then one so afflicted should struggle and struggle again to overcome it. And I almost missed that. I said, most of us think that when you try something and you fail, you give up. Sooner or later, they say that's the definition of insanity, that you keep doing the same thing expecting a different result. Well, not according to Shoghi Effendi in this regard. Some things you need to struggle and struggle again, just like lifting weights, that you keep doing it over and over again and you gradually grow. Now, I do not want this discussion, we're going to get into discussion right now. In a few minutes we're going to go into discussion, and I do not want this discussion to devolve into a criticism of other Baha'is. I'm not interested in that discussion, to go around and complain about how the Baha'i community is unloving and homophobic and so on, because all I'm concerned about is my attitude. How can I be more loving, and how can we be more loving? After all, if we are told to not consider the faults of others and to be not concerned with the faults of others, I cannot stand here in all humility and say I am concerned about the fault of other people being concerned with the faults of others. I can't do that. That's hypocritical. It's very, very easy to find fault with the Baha'is or the Baha'i community on this issue. It's a cheap shot. You can find it. But newsflash, we're not perfect. Many times people will say to me, oh my God, my local assembly is not infallible. They don't really say it in those terms, but they might as well. They say, oh my God, my local assembly is not infallible. Horror, shame, surprise. And guess what? We're never told or promised that local assemblies are going to be infallible. So they say, oh my God, the Baha'is are not infallible. Baha'is are not perfect. Oh my God, that invalidates the Baha'i faith because the Baha'is are not perfect. No, I'm sorry, big deal. It has nothing to do with this. Baha'is are not perfect. Local assemblies are not infallible. No one is infallible except the guardian, the House of Justice, Abd Baha. But we don't want to find faults in other people. Rather, we notice these faults in the general Baha'i community, and it causes us immediately to think of ourselves, how can we become more like the way we see it? Not to point out their faults, but to immediately turn it back on us, and what can we do to be more loving, to be more accepting, to be more embracing of all peoples who are dealing with this. I had two experiences that were very, very interesting, and they happened within the space of about a month apart, way back in the early 1990s. The first experience I had was that I got this phone call one night, late in the night, like in the middle of the night, and they said, gay and lesbian hotline, they said. And I said, no, I think you got the wrong number, or something like that. And they said, yes, but isn't this the gay and lesbian hotline? And I said, Artie, come on, cut with the joke. Because I thought it was my friend Artie, who he's just the kind of guy that would probably do that. It's not very funny, but that's the way he is. And then I realized, no, it wasn't Artie. So I hung up, and then about 3 nights later, I got a similar call, something different, gay and lesbian hotline. And this happened maybe 4, 5, 6, 7 times over about every 2 or 3 nights, for about a couple weeks. And by this time, I realized that there was some cross line or wrong number, something was going on. And so somebody called, it's a gay and lesbian hotline, or gay hotline, they said, and he had a very shaky voice, sounded a little bit inebriated, not so much. And I said, no, this is not that. I think you've got the wrong number. Check the number, and I think you'll find that you're 1 digit off or something like that. And he immediately started saying, I am going to kill myself right now. He said, I cannot go on living. And the way in which he said it just shook me to my very bones. I could tell that he was sincere. He was very young. It turned out I think he was like 15 or 16. And he had such guilt, and he had such shame, and such self-loathing that it broke my heart. And I knew that if I said anything, he was going to pull the trigger right then and there. I could tell. I mean, this is a very sincere thing. So I tried to keep him on the line. I tried to talk to him. And I made every mistake in the book, because I wasn't trained how to do this. I said, well, why would you want to kill yourself? And then, of course, he explained the whole reason, and then it made it worse. Because now he was just, I thought, oh, that's right, I shouldn't probably do that. But I wasn't trained, I didn't have any experience in this. I was just trying so hard to keep this young boy alive. Anyway, I had 2 telephones, and after talking to him, I just tried to keep him on the line for about, 90 minutes at least. And I said to him, find that publication where it has the number, that you had my number. And he read the number, and it was my number. I said, are you reading it straight? He said, yes. And I said, are there any other numbers? He said, yes, there's one for every area code in the country. Because this is in the early 90s, they didn't have cell phones. So I said, well, give me one of the other numbers. And then I said, listen, I want to make this very clear to you. I'm going to keep you on the phone. I'm going to pick up my other phone. I picked the other phone. I called the other number. I told the people what was going on. And they said, we need you very carefully. This is in the days of payphones. They said, we need you to very carefully confirm with him what this other number is. Get him to read it back to you 3 or 4 times and get him to repeat back to you that he's going to hang up your line and call this line. So I did all that, and they guided me through, and then I did it, and then he hung up the phone, he did it, and then later the next day, they called me from the gay and lesbian hotline. They were in Texas, their main headquarters, and they thanked me, and they said they spent another 2 or 3 hours with him on the phone, and they saved his life. And I never would have been exposed to something like this had it not been an accident of wrong number. So anyway, within a month or so of that, I was at a meeting for the Bahá'í World Congress on the program committee for the Bahá'í World Congress. And we would meet once a month in New York City for a whole weekend. Usually longer. I think we'd meet Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, finish around Sunday lunchtime. And these were the most exciting meetings I ever had in my life. They were always attended usually by at least one member of the House of Justice, usually Glenford Mitchell and also his wife Bahia, and by Douglas Martin and by Farouz Kazemzadeh and Wilma Ellis, the counselor, and the National Assembly members. And we were reading the guidance from the House of Justice as we were planning this World Congress. You can't imagine anything more exciting or thrilling than these meetings. And we did them once a month for almost 2 years. And I remember it was one Sunday, the last Sunday in June of 1992, the Holy Year, when I finished this meeting. And as you know, the Baha'i offices there are right up near the United Nations buildings on the far east side of Manhattan. And my hotel was on the western side of Fifth Avenue. So I came out of the meeting, 1 or 2 o'clock. I just had 3 days in heaven consulting with House members and counselors about the World Congress. And I came across Manhattan and I got to Fifth Avenue and I could see my hotel right there, just across the street. And I noticed there was a parade going on. And I said, okay, I just got to get across. And I tried to dive across the parade. And a policeman stopped me. He said, no, you cannot go. You can't go across this parade. And I looked at the parade, and I noticed some very interesting things. And I said, what is the parade? And he said, this is the biggest and the most important gay pride parade in the world. It had started in New York City, I think, in the 60s when there was a riot, and it became the founder. It is the mother of all gay pride parades. And I said, what do I do? And he says, well, you're going to have to go all the way to the beginning of the parade, which is on 36th. Okay, I was like on 50th. Okay, you have to walk all the way along the parade, and then you can go around behind it, and then you have to walk all the way. I said, my hotel's right there. You walk the parade twice, he said to me. So I did it. I walked all the way down. So I marched the Gay Pride Parade twice. Okay, immediately after walking out of a World Congress meeting. And I saw things that I have never seen in my life before. Okay, I saw some things that I cannot unring the bell of some things that I saw in this parade. And it was so jarring to come after this spiritual meeting that I had, and to think of New York as the city of the covenant and so on, and to have to march the full length of this parade. But as I was walking up in the parade, something struck me. These people were so joyous, and they were so happy, and there was such a feeling of acceptance and love. And I thought about how many of these people were probably like that boy, that many of them were beaten up in school and brutalized, and maybe committed suicide, and that they had to overcome all kinds of fears to express it to their family and their friends. And now in this environment they can share, for maybe once in their life, unabated love and wholehearted acceptance. And it was hard for me not to compare it and think this is a healthier place to be than where that boy was on the telephone. I could not help that. And it made me think, why can it not be that everyone dealing with this problem does not feel the same degree of love and acceptance within the Baha'i community they could even feel in that Gay Pride Parade? Why would it not be? And so I think I had quite a spiritual awakening even in that concept. Not that I don't believe in the Baha'i teachings on it, but I see the power of love and acceptance and self-worth. And that's what I found in that sense. So I'm going to end there, and we can open it up to discussion, questions, comments, whatever. Thank you all.